Should we do that thing where we pretend we're in the middle of an organic conversation and then you just decided to start recording?
Okay, the show's starting. It's time. Welcome to Analog Adventure, an after-hours podcast from Stacks Book Club. My name's Crispin Jeffrey Frank. I'm a co-founder of Stacks Book Club, and joining me today is one of our lead booktenders here at Stacks, Matt.
Hi.
Say hello to the people.
Hello.
Matt, what are you drinking tonight, buddy?
It's just a basic-ass Dragoon IPA.
Sweet. I've got the non-alcoholic Cerveza from Athletic Brewing because I'm over 40 and I can't drink during the week. So today we're going to be talking about sci-fi.
Yes.
It's kind of a weird year, 2024 for sci-fi, I felt at least.
Yeah.
So I want to dig into it a little bit with you. I don't know if I consider you like our go-to guy on sci-fi. I know you don't necessarily consider that.
No.
I know.
I don't consider myself a go-to.
Maybe it's the Jeff Vandermeer series, but
yeah,
we'll maybe do what we got.
I'm kind of a one-track mind with
Weird.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So really, like, what got me thinking about this idea, this topic, we all just got our 2024 year in review on Spotify. And if you're on any of the book tracking apps, if you got one from the one that we don't talk about and from the one you should be on, which is Storygraph. And as I was looking through my results, I expected it to be, like in a normal year, I would say I'm like 20 to 25% sci-fi as my genre split. And this year, it was lower than that. It was like in like the 10 or 12%. I can't remember exactly. And so I started thinking like, oh, I must have missed some stuff. So I went back and, we here at the store have a lot of sales data. We can kind of look through what came out this year pretty easily. And as I started scrolling through, I started to feel like the books that were being considered like best sci-fi of the year, in my opinion, don't fit in sci-fi.
Yeah.
So let's start there. What's the difference for you between magical realism and sci-fi or sci-fi and fantasy? Like when is something definitely sci-fi?
I feel like I've heard a lot of people talk about how it has, if it's science fiction versus science fantasy, it has to be based on, like, the story couldn't exist without the technology that's being featured. I'm not that persnickety about it, so it's like robots is sci-fi,
okay,
and swords is fantasy.
Always.
And people with stuff coming out of them is magical realism.
All right.
That's as specific as I can.
All right, so let's. I know maybe you haven't read all of these books, and we collectively haven't read all of these books, but like this year's like best of sci-fi includes books like The Ministry of Time. For me, that's a very good book. I enjoyed reading it. But that's magical realism, not sci-fi in my mind, because to your point, there obviously is technology. If you haven't read the book, there's technology that creates this time door, literally, and people are brought from various points in world history forward into time. But once they've made that leap, the door becomes basically irrelevant. There's never a conversation about the technology behind the door. The door is really never revisited.
Yeah.
It's a story construct to get someone from 1650 to, whatever the era of the book is. And to me, that means magical realism versus sci-fi.
That's a fair point. I'll buy that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, let's talk about what we did like in sci-fi this year. So, what was your like top tier number one sci-fi release?
The number one, no surprise, is Absolution by Jeff Vandermeer. I've been looking forward to it for like 2 years. And then a close second, the book of Elsewhere by China Miéville and Keanu Reeves, which we were talking about earlier. I don't know if I totally consider that sci-fi. That's more like you were saying, where there's a big fantasy element. It just kind of happens to take place in a sci-fi adjacent universe, but it's not.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that book definitely could be either one. I would like hear arguments for either one. We shelve it here in sci-fi. I think if it was shelved in fantasy, that would make perfect sense to me.
Or even horror.
I could see that too. Yeah, and I think that to me is sort of like indicative of like what I think was the wider trend of 2024 science fiction wise is like when I think of science fiction, I think of space operas. I think of like advanced technology, cyberpunk, exactly, or like Blake Crouch style, like, or Andy Weir style, like very heavily weighted on real world applications of science that lead to things like, interdimensional existences or, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And I felt like this year We got a lot more things that skew towards magical realism. It's a broader appeal as a bookseller. Like we know we sell more books in the big section than we do in the small section. So like I kind of get it from that perspective. But I really felt like we were missing space operas specifically, which is why I'll talk about one of my favorite books from science fiction for this year. Is a debut book by an author named Ellen Sagas, who I actually spoke to about her book Cascade Failure, which is like a rowdy adventure. I would call it a space opera because it exists in a world that's not ours. It's somewhere in space. It has its own government. It has its own like set of rules and operating systems. And to me is like more of like a Becky Chambers style. Like we're going somewhere else that we've never been. It has nothing to do with where we are. There happens to be like humans or human-like characters, but like what's going on in our world doesn't exist there, which to me is like, that's like what I prefer, like tried and true classic science fiction.
Yeah, that sounds like an Ursula K. Le Guin style premise, where it's like come up with an excuse to get as far away from us in time and place as possible, and then you can use it as like a playground for ideas of what would it be like if this completely different social structure existed.
Yeah,
I like that.
I also think it's like a nice backdrop too whenever we do leave like our galaxy, to be able to take things that did happen here and then like repackage them and tell them somewhere else. And the thought is, you know, like it feels like it's an original story, but it's actually inspired by real events. And I really enjoy that too when sci-fi. So I think Ursula K. Le Guin does that a lot. Like she was very prophetic in a lot of ways in terms of like technology that she was introducing. I think that's one of the things I love about science fiction, especially, is that it does have like a little bit of a predictive element to it. Like not everything in a science fiction book always comes true, but I feel like science fiction writers are always looking at trends or have like a sense of like technology is going in this way. What's the next logical leap, or what's even a couple leaps beyond what seems logical? And eventually we seem to catch up.
Well, that, and then I think a lot of the people that are driving actual technology growth are also nerds. So when they name things, they're going to look to like, well, what's that? What did Ursula K. Le Guin or William Gibson call it? I'm going to call my thing that. And then it kind of like self-fulfilling prophecies.
Self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. I love that. I think one of the other books that I really enjoyed this year was Moonbound by Robin Sloan. You haven't checked that one out, right?
No, I've never read anything by Robin Sloan. Sourdough, which
I would say Sourdough is magical realism. Like, there's like a fantastical element. It's definitely not science fiction. If anything, it's fantasy. I think I would say magical realism. Like, I think in Sourdough you get magical elements. Like there's something magical about the sourdough itself, but there's nothing that's like out of context for our world, I guess, is how I look at that. So Sourdough, and then Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore. Bookstore books obviously like hit for me almost always. Give me like dark academia and like occultism in a bookstore I'm in. And so Moonbound is like considered part of the Penumbraverse, which like, I don't know if I picked that up or not when I read it. But it's like, to me, it's like Robin Sloan really like taking a leap and stepping out on the edge. It's a future version of society where humans have like cracked the evolutionary code, basically, like finally figured out what life really is about, and technology starts to explode at like this rapid rate, and humans are now like living in space, and our consciousnesses are like uploaded into devices and they're kind of stored, and the main character of the book is sort of like the chosen one, and he has, I don't even know how to describe it. He has like a tchotchke basically that is like sentient, and it's sort of like his Jiminy Cricket. And so like this prophetic kid's got to go out and kind of like save mankind from themselves again.
I don't know why that's the thing that sold me on it.
And it's so wild because it's so wild and strange. It's like, it's so unexpected. But to me, that's what I'm looking for in science fiction. I just feel like this year, maybe we missed it. Like, let us know in the comments, what did we miss in science fiction? But I felt like it was a lot more of these magical realism or like, fantasy things kind of moonlighting as science fiction as opposed to like hardcore science fiction.
I was thinking about that earlier too, that there's probably a lot, because I'm not drawn to the type of science fiction I used to be, so I'm not seeking it out. So what I think of as new science fiction is the stuff that's being really heavily promoted. And most of the genre stuff that's being promoted is fantasy and romantasy. But I think a lot of the smaller presses are doing they're able to take bigger risks because their whole goal is to just get unpublished authors published. And
right.
so they're going to be people who have pretty like unconventional ideas about what to do with science fiction. And I feel like I'm not digging into those wells deep enough, but I have a feeling that there's something worth looking
Yeah, I
into.
mean, I think that's always the challenge is like, you know, how many books do we read that we know people are going to come in and ask about, and we know we need to be ready to talk about versus finding the books. Like I consider Cascade Failure to be off the radar. Like I think most people probably wouldn't know that there's one, let alone two books in that duology. They're both out. They're both available. So yeah, it's kind of always like splitting that medium of like reading deep enough to find something that no one else is talking about, but also, you know, we have a responsibility here to like be able to talk to people about other books too. So.
Yeah.
So what's on your wish list for 2025? What's like the one or two books that you're most excited about?
The two that I'm most excited about, one of them is by a Korean author named Yoo-Han Kim. It's called Black Orb. In Seoul, Korea, suddenly these black orbs start showing up out of nowhere and sucking people up into them. And that's as much as I know about it. And that's all I need to know.
in.
It reminds me of one of my favorite Neon Genesis Evangelion episodes. There's another one by Michael Sisko, who mostly writes kind of horror, weird fantasy adjacent stuff. But this one it's called Black Brain, spelled Brane. And it's about a really bizarre institute that is equal parts like theoretical quantum physics type study and also occult, and it's almost like a ritualistic study of black holes. I have the digital arc through Edelweiss, and the first 7 or 8 pages of it that I've read are super bizarre.
Nice.
But he's great.
That's right up your alley.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Just I have
the
no
weird
idea where I
about it.
am, where it's going, who anybody is, or what I'm supposed to make of it, and that's how I want to feel all the time.
Love it. Yeah, those sound both just like you. So Black Orb, is that a book that has already been released in Korea and is now being translated, or is
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
I feel like I've been reading a lot more books in translation from Japan and Korea lately than I ever have in the last couple years. I don't know why that trend, but like maybe we're just getting more of them, so they're being put in front of me a lot more. But I mean, it's like anything, right? Like Americans aren't the only ones creating great art. Like,
but we're maybe the only ones who think we're the only ones.
I would generally tend to agree with that. Yeah. So getting more of these books in translation and kind of getting out and seeing how like other cultures are telling these stories, I think is awesome.
Yeah.
For me, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I think one of the other trends that we saw in 2024 in science fiction is like repackaging of existing work. So whether that's like special editions coming out, 50th anniversary, you know, like repackaging with sprayed edges, which is like a huge trend. We'll talk about on another podcast, I'm sure, at some point. And so like along those lines, which comes out in January, which I think is already out now, is the Murderbot series by Martha Wells. It's a series of novellas. I think there's like 7 or maybe even 8 or 9. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
And they released in hardcover and then in paperback. And so depending on like where you are in that journey, like I know we have a staff member here, Ricky, who wants them all on hardcover, but is having trouble like getting them all. Well, they've now been released as like volume sets. So the 9 books or however many are in the series have been released in 3 volumes now. So I think they look just more like a regular paperback science fiction release. So I'm excited to see if the series gets more popular.
Yeah.
Now that
it's
it
less
looks
of
like a more
risk
traditional book.
to get like 3 novellas in one than to commit to a single hardcover novella. That's still like
they're not. Yeah, they still
It's not
basically the price of a paperback.
Yeah.
So like from a consumerism standpoint, like it's a way better bang for your buck now.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited to see that series maybe picks up a little bit more interest. It also is going to be on Apple TV this year, so also be interested to see
didn't know
what that looks like.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Murderbot?
No, not
So
at all.
Murderbot-
the covers are like, they're very sexy,
Yeah.
like little slim.
Murderbot's like
novella.
one of my favorite current sci-fi devices, which is sentient AI. We're obviously like living in the era of like young AI and
Dumb AI.
again, like thinking about science fiction writers and like having that like long range view on where technology going. In this series, Murderbot, as his name suggests, is like a robot for hire, basically an AI machine for hire. He does like security for corporate vessels of some sort. But somewhere along the way, he begins to gain autonomy and start to make decisions himself,
Yeah.
and sort of unplugs from the system, and he goes on the run. But he's got these big gaps in his memory where his memory's been wiped, like mission after mission.
Yeah.
And so he knows that he's done like bad things, but he doesn't know what they are. He doesn't know who made him do it. And so he basically goes on this like mission of self-discovery and exploration to figure out like, what did I do? Why did I do it? Who made me do it? And like, how do I get revenge?
Like revenge, but also coming of age a little bit.
Yeah,
Where you're like,
but it's
figuring
really
yourself
fun
out.
because the way that he like teaches himself about the world is by consuming media. But he's an AI, so he can consume like, millions of data points, at any given time. And so it's just kind of fun to like listen to the murder bot like reflect on the media he's consuming and then how that like affects his life. So I'm excited about that. The true new release that I'm excited for, Ray Naylor, he wrote The Mountain Under the Sea was like his last big book.
Yeah,
which is like I think Mountain and the Sea I would say is like in that like liminal space between magical realism and fantasy, or I mean sci-fi. I think we've actually like moved it around in here a couple times.
Yeah.
But this one feels more straight science fiction and it has more AI. So this one is set in like a near future society where authoritarianism is on the rise. Maybe not that strange of an idea. But in like huge portions of the world, citizens have elected to elect AI governors, presidents, prime ministers, basically have turned over controlling power and ruling, to AI because it's in theory more balanced and less partisan.
Yeah.
And there's other parts of the world that are sort of like doing the opposite and trying to detach. And so it's like this, I don't know, global political saga story. I don't know what it's going to be. I just got a digital copy of it last week, so I haven't dug in yet, but I'm really excited about the idea of, and again, not that far-fetched, like,
yeah, I feel like that's definitely something that,
how soon is it before, we have AI CEOs making decisions about companies, or AI physicians making decisions about healthcare? Like, it's already happening in the background.
I don't know if I mind the CEO version, but
but like taking sort of, I guess, like front and center. So that's that book is called Where the Axe is Buried. That's out April 1st from Ray Naylor. Cool.
I feel like I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't mention that there's a David Bowie song called The Savior Machine that's the same premise. So people have been thinking about that for a long time. So I'm excited that we're now reaching the point where like the media that thinks about that and the possibility are getting closer and closer.
Nice.
Rest in peace, David Bowie.
There we go.
Yeah.
If you could get a novel by any science fiction author this year, whose next book do you want?
William Gibson. He does this thing where he'll like create a universe and do one trilogy in it and then move on to the next thing. The one he's working on right now, there's a show on the Bad Guy Network called The Peripheral based on one of his novels. It's the Jackpot trilogy. Basically, at some point in the future, they come up with a way to send data back in time. So they're able to communicate with the past, but anything they do that changes the past creates stubs in new directions. The basic plot is that they send instructions back to, I think when the book came out, it was like 7 or 8 years in our future, maybe further, on how to build a 3D printed interface where you could then control a robot in the future of the present. And so you could effectively time travel. He has the first 2 books out so far, and I think he was going to publish the 3rd one this year, but then the election happened and that changed plot points in the story. So he's got to rewrite big chunks of it. I know that happened with the last election of this type. So I'm hoping that actually comes out this year because I want to dig into that series and read the whole trilogy back to back.
Cool. For me, I think it would be Andy Weir. Like, it's been a couple years since Project Hail Mary. I loved The Martian. I thought the Artemis, I have like a second book theory, which basically is author spends years, decades, their entire lives thinking about that first story. They pour so much time and energy into it. It comes out amazing. And then I feel like their publisher is probably like, hey, do it again, but do it faster because we want to keep making money.
Yeah.
And then that second book is kind of like flat. For me, I thought Artemis was like a fine, fun book, but it wasn't The Martian, and he bounced back with Project Hail Mary. But it's been a couple years now. It's been like 3 or 4 years since that book debuted, so I'm ready for the next science heavy like space story from
Because he
Andy
seems a little bit like, I've never read him, but I know Michael Crichton would always do a thing where at the beginning he would say, this is the current like state of the science that I'm basing this novel on, and everything else is fiction. I get the impression from Andy Weir that he's kind of like, this is a snapshot of where we are now, and then the story is based on that. Is that the kind of
Similar but different. Yeah, I mean, normally like in his, you know, acknowledgments in the back of the book, he'll kind of tell you like, here's all of the various astrophysicists and you know, like people that actually know what space is like and how, you know, how the atmosphere would react and like what technology would and wouldn't work. And so like he's usually telling like, I think he approaches it from like, what's the story first, and then I feel like he back ends into the science once like the story structure is built. And so you always feel like the science always feels real enough to just be like, yeah, I believe that what that character is telling me is accurate. And then usually at the end he kind of pays that off with like, you know, here's the Caltech dudes that I like talk to about, you know, jet propulsion, and that's how we came up with the system that powers this thing. So like similar but different, but yeah. Any last thoughts on Sci-Fi 2024?
I wish I'd read more of it.
All right.
I wish there'd been more of it to read.
I agree. Well, cheers to 2025. Hopefully it's a better year
We're gonna really do that.
for science fiction. Matt, tell the people where they can follow you.
On Instagram, _Matt_Stu_art. Can we do that thing?
Sure, we'll figure that out.
We'll put it right here. Yeah, Jerome.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll see you next time.